One. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tech and Soul podcast. I am Tamika Key.
And I am Lynn D. Johnson.
An AI machine. It is Lynn space D space Johnson, not Lynn D Johnson. We're gonna have a conversation probably about AI among other things, but the tools don't listen. But we want you to listen, and we love that you are listening to us now. We also want you to subscribe. So hit the subscribe button below, subscribe to us on Substack. And also, if you want to sponsor amazing discourse and dialogue, you should sponsor us because we're doing an amazing show. Right, Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking for partners too. So we're happy to collaborate with some folks if our interests align.
If our interests align. Speaking of aligned interests, we have a super aligned, interesting guest with us, and it's Miss Elisa Camahort Page. Elisa, do you want to tell the audience how you describe yourself?
Sure. Hi, Lynn. Hi, Tamika. Great to see you both. I'm Elisa Camahort Page. I live in San Jose, California, and I came out of the world of traditional tech in the early aughts, and I co-founded a company called BlogHer, which is where I met Lynn almost 20 years ago. I hate to reveal, but that is true. And I always like to say that BlogHer, I founded it with two other women, Jory Desjardins and Lisa Stone. We raised 4 rounds of venture capital before exiting by acquisition. And the percentage of dollars, VC dollars, that went to all women founded teams in 2007 when we raised our first round was 2%. And all of you out there probably know that that number has not budged here in 2024. So I always just like to point out we got a lot of room for improvement, room for progress. So that's where I really got into the world of media. I had been like a tech/product person, got into the world of media, ended up publishing a book, which I co-authored with 2 other amazing women, Carolyn Duran and Jamia Wilson. And since then, I've been consulting and coaching and going in-house, really early stage startups, writing, podcasting, doing all the things because I contain multitudes. And I actually launched in January a new project with one of my BlogHer co-founders, Jory. We launched a project called Optionality in January to think about the future of work for people like, I suspect, all of us, you, Tamika and Lynn, but all of us listening who, we want to have many irons in the fire. We want to mitigate our risk of being all in 120%, making a lot of money for somebody else. We want to find ways to work with people that give us our due, but also give us our space. And so that's me.
I'm just
Go ahead, Tamika.
multitudes in that sentence. The reason I wanted to ask you to describe yourself was because, when I think of Elisa Camahort Page, I think of BlogHer, and I also and sort of one of the questions in advance to you was, in a world in this Web 3.0 world, let's call it, right? I think there was the Web 1.0 version, and I think BlogHer to me is very synonymous with the Web 2.0 era, the era of the rise of social media, the rise of bloggers. Like this, it felt new and groundbreaking and different, but it also felt warm and community on some levels. And so I didn't want to sort of not pigeonhole you, but I didn't want to have you be defined by that era because it's such a different era now. But I remember wanting very much to be able to be a successful blogger. I remember wanting to, and actually I think you were one of the keynotes or one of the speakers at AdTech, which is a conference that I programmed at the time. And I remember and I think it was close to the acquisition by She Knows. And it was just this conversation at the time around creating content and monetizing content for women and why advertisers needed to invest in that and what the value proposition was. And I don't know, I just said a bunch of stuff too, but it's kind of amazing that we're having some of these still having some of the same
conversations.
Absolutely, we are. Like I still hear that stat I used in 2006 about 80% plus of household purchases are controlled by women. Like that stat is evergreen, will be used forever. It's back when we started in 2005 is when we had the first BlogHer conference where Lynn spoke. And a lot of people don't remember that we started with the conference, and we didn't start as a company. Lisa, Jory, and I just got together. We weren't friends or colleagues. We met each other serendipitously and just decided to work on this project together, put our own credit cards down to reserve a space. And that was the first thing we did. It was only after that first conference. We hadn't talked about it being a company. We hadn't talked about carrying on. We just wanted to do this thing, to have a conference like any other tech conference or blogging conference where all the speakers happened to be women talking about their areas of expertise. We weren't talking about being women. We just were women, and we were talking about politics, and we were talking about business, and we were talking about personal blogging, and we were talking about hip hop bloggers. That was Lynn's topic. And we were just women doing that. Mm. It was only after the first conference that we decided to start a company at all. And, but at the time there was no social media. There was blogs, there were Yahoo groups, there was tribe.net, if you remember that. There was chat, IRC and like all the traditional chat stuff. It just didn't exist. And so, but it was right at that beginning of Web 2.0. And I always used to say that Web 1.0 was broadcast. Like everybody just figured out they needed to like unidirectionally send information out. And then in Web 2.0, a lot of people thought that what defined Web 2.0 was the fact that there was talk back, like there was comments, there was the ability to like engage. But I used to draw a further distinction, which was to say that online community is about a cycle of call and response. And so you're not a community if you don't answer when people talk back. And that's what the traditional media was so very bad at. And that's why they really started, they really resented bloggers. But I'll never forget, I was at I was on a panel with the guy who was like second in command at News Corp, and he was railing against bloggers using links to his articles to have these conversations. I'm like, well, maybe if you tried to have conversations with people, maybe if you moderated your comments so they weren't cesspools, and maybe if you talked and engaged with your readers, they wouldn't need to come to bloggers to talk about the things they want to talk about. And, you could have this conversation today. Most mainstream media has turned off comments. If they do have comments, the reporters don't really chime in on their own pieces. They do, I think some of them do a better job of moderating, but, so some topics are just evergreen. And then of course, social media, it started with Facebook becoming available to non-college adults, Twitter in 2006, YouTube started about the same time we did, Instagram, all of those things. And then, so the definition of a creator or a blogger just sort of expanded to include, but early on, most people were bloggers who used those tools to promote their blogging. Mm-hmm. And the reason people liked blogging was because I owned my piece of the internet. This was as a Jay Rosen from NYU called it, your own little personal printing press. Mm-hmm. Yes. And we liked that. And I think a lot of people, we miss that because we're under the control of platforms. We don't control what we see. We don't control who sees us. We don't control how it's monetized. And I think I miss that as a creator, but there are just different kinds of creators who have learned how to work within that construct.
Right. We're at the mercy of algorithms, right? And
yes,
you touched on so many topics.
So much. I was like, oh my God.
So many, like I'm like I have notes in my head and I'm opening stuff, but it's interesting. You said, when BlogHer started, there was no social media. Actually, I started blogging because I had worked at blackplanet.com, which is early social media, right? Like
I would call that online community though, right?
Online community.
It was centralized, right? It was centralized.
Yes, it was centralized. It wasn't going out to the
right.
web, right? So similar to how the BBSs were before it was distributed within that community. Yeah. And coming out of that, getting laid off because, all those online communities that launched and had these big parties and spent all this money.
.com bust, baby.
Right. So I started a blog, right? And earlier you mentioned something about creating space, right, for voices and for people. And so for me to come to BlogHer was like, I can go and talk about hip hop feminism blogging, right? Like, and what does that mean? And there weren't many folks like me at the time. But the other thing that really, that you said that I keep thinking about is about how women are responsible for most of the purchases. And one thing I really remember about the BlogHer events is how you guys integrated the sponsorships, right? Like I got to drive a car, I got to taste yogurt, I got to, it was all very experiential. So that's another thing. It's like media companies are, although you say like the platform, so the platforms have taken over, right? And so the media companies themselves are trying to gain their audiences back. So some of them are trying to do community things now.
Yeah,
right?
events are big in the mainstream media space now. That's true.
Yes, for sure, for sure. Yeah, what were you going to say, Tamika?
Elisa, again, she also said so many things
many things. I have more to ask her, actually.
All right, but so the thing that was really interesting, there's a distinction that you also just made even now in terms of kind of the difference between online community versus social media. And I think that's a mentality shift. Like I remember I was a reporter. I was a journalist for a website called Paid Content. And I was
sure. Rafat, that's Rafat's site, right?
Yeah. And I was terrified when we opened up comments because I was sort of more of a traditionally trained journalist. I research, I write my story, I have no opinion. I'm supposed to have as much of no opinion as possible, right? And that's it. And I put it out there. And then maybe there's a separate place for dialogue. But I remember we opened up comments on Paid Content and like people would say such mean stuff, like just mean things. And I'm like a little sensitive, I'm a little sensitive creature. And I just, one, as a writer, like you don't want someone to say your writing is bad. Two, as as a woman, as a Black woman working in tech, and I was covering video games, and people would say stuff like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking. Like, it was like this assault. And so I remember, and so when you say, right, media companies, they turn off the comments and journalists don't engage, the old school kind of journalist person in me was like, of course we did that. People are mean and terrible. And when you open up the fire hose, they can assault you. I think there is I think creators and journalists and bloggers are a different beast now. I think they've come to, because they've kind of grown up in this, I don't know what this Web3 era is, but they've been assaulted by the fire hose of data and content. Yeah. They're used to it. They know how to, one, build the community, two, react to the community, and then three, turn off the haters and monetize it. And I'm like, can you teach me your ways, young people? Can you teach me how to do this?
Well, you brought up an interesting point, which is monetize. I remember, I don't know if you all remember, a few years back, South by Southwest. I've been on the programming committee of South by Southwest for almost 20 years. And they went through a phase where they ended up producing this online harassment summit, a hastily added thing because there was so much drama going on. And I've forgotten the initial genesis of it, but they decided to put together this summit on it. And they wanted me to speak on a panel about media companies and what they're doing against hate speech and harassment on their sites. And I'm like, I think that's the wrong assumption to make in the headline of this panel, that they are doing that. We should discuss whether they're doing that, because my premise was like, no, they're monetizing that. When you're talking about CPM-based advertising, who care? You have to care about what's giving you those impressions to change it. And I did not see that mainstream media companies cared. Because why some, like I think when NPR turned off their comments, they kind of figured out that the vast majority of comments were from this incredibly small slice of their readers who were trolls, basically, that 90% of what people wanted to do there was trolls. And they're like, we're not losing community or conversation by turning this off. But for a lot of media companies, if that was keeping their numbers up, their impressions up, and therefore keeping their ad dollars up, that was a business decision they made to monetize hate. And I questioned the assumption they wanted to do anything about it, really. And that is Facebook for sure, was Twitter even before our current melon husk era. Like, they are monetizing the hate. That's my, I like code names for people. Like, I don't need to get trolls coming after me. So whenever I talk about figures like melon husk, or who I call P45 with an asterisk, like I don't need people coming after me. So I just use code names. And if you know, you know.
Yeah.
But people, I'm not, people who follow me know what I mean by those things. And so it's fine with me. So this was a business decision. It was a business decision at Facebook to not invest in moderation from the beginning. Of course, if you try to approach it once you've hit 1 billion users, it's going to seem like it's an outsized investment to try and do anything about it now. But if you had built it into your model, when I think about BlogHer and our publishing network, we ended up working with thousands of bloggers, and we kind of figured out a model of how many people could one person kind of oversee her group of bloggers, make sure they were meeting our guidelines, make sure everything was in line. How many people could one person manage? And we built it into our model that if we wanted to grow from our first 150 bloggers to 1,500 bloggers to 4,000 bloggers, we needed to grow those people too. And maybe today we would have more automation than we did then, or more AI taking care of it. But you know what? Automation, we did implement automation. You still needed the human overlay, because automation does not get context or sentiment or sarcasm or any of these things. I used to look at our little reports and they're like, oh, someone posted something really negative about BlogHer. What did they say? And what they said is, oh my God, I'm so upset. I can't make it to BlogHer this year because blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that is not negative sentiment. That is like that's a fan's sentiment, And so today they have more automation. They can have more support through AI, but it's still, you could build it into your model. They chose not to. So by the time they were like, oh shit, I guess I got to do something about this. Yeah, it was going to be a big, huge investment, and they were going to get dinged on Wall Street. And, there are going to be all these negative ramifications, but they have the choice early on.
I have another question, Lynn, but before because I'll do this. And so I'm like,
yes. No, the only thing I was going to say is I think it's interesting because MSM, especially news, right? Advertisers will block news altogether because of certain topics that news writes about, but meanwhile still spend money on the platforms. So it's
spend the money.
Go ahead, Tamika, you're making a face.
They spend the money on the platforms because of what Elisa said, the eyeballs, and also because the platforms provide attribution. The platforms can tell you, if I put $1,000 in, here is exactly what I got out of that. That's the whole separate sort of walled gardens. Whether they should grade their own homework is a separate conversation. But unfortunately for us, for the good of society, Facebook has extremely good performance metrics. You put $1 in, you get X out, and it's very
what you're getting, right?
Well, and I think there's plausible deniability. That's the thing. The fall of contextual advertising and the rise of programmatic advertising is one part commodification and how low can you go on price. But the other part of it is it's plausible deniability. So someone can say they're advertising to people, not on content. And they can wait till someone catches them out and calls them out and go, oh no, we're horrified. Oh, how could our ads be shown next to Nazis? Like, that's terrible. We'll do something about it now. But they're not proactively doing stuff about it.
So we have been in the tech realm as our show goes. We could get deep into those programmatic weeds. I do want to pull us out a little bit and hopefully bridge to what you're doing in the world now. Because something that you said about when you and Jory and Lisa Stone got together, you had an idea and you wanted to do this thing. And you're like, we're going to put our blood, sweat, and tears and our money into this thing that we want to do. You didn't say, I want to build a multi-million-dollar media company.
Yeah.
And I think, is that mentality different? And is that something that you talk about in terms of optionality now? Because I think so many people have these ideas for things that they want to do. Lynn and I, we're doing this podcast because we
Right.
love talking to each other and love talking to people,
Right.
but we still want to build a media company. And so do you feel like we are in a place where people can still just want to create things because they want to create them, or
More
does
than ever.
everything need to be monetized?
No, more than ever. Like there's so many tools, there's so many ways, and especially with the advent of hybrid, more remote work, more like there's so much capacity and freedom to let people determine their own fates. I think if you look at the last 20 years of the workplace, you can start with the dot-com bust. First there was 9/11, right? Then there's the dot-com bust. Then there's the financial crash of 2008. And a lot of how I know Silicon Valley came back from the financial crash was to go doubling down on the gig economy and create a whole economy that favored the employer and marginalized the workers, and took and concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands. The whole change of how options and equity work in Silicon Valley from the dot-com days to today is really, it concentrates the wealth so much differently. And supposedly in the name of protecting investors, but I think all it protects is the institutional investors and the boards, you know, the really top level folks. You have all of that happen. Then you have the pandemic lockdown, the great resignation, the great pushback that seems to be based mostly on real estate and command and control versus any actual data about productivity or losing a step. So the last 20 years have been filled with this kind of really recycled trauma for people who are working. And part of the response has always been, at least where I sit in Silicon Valley, ever since the dot-com peaked and started going down, what I love about living here is that everybody's got something going on. Like you talk to anybody and they've got, oh, this is what I do, but also I'm working on this and I have this, and they will tell you about it. And they're very open. I don't know if New York has changed, but New York used to feel much more close to the vest to me. Like people would worry about telling someone something because they might steal it from them. And I'm like, you cannot make it better all on your own, close to your vest. You can only make it better by getting a response. So I don't know if New York has opened up a little more.
New York is still that way.
Okay.
It's still that way, unfortunately. Yeah. All of that you said has happened over the past 20 years is really interesting. I mean, do you think so I work at a labor college as well. I teach at a labor college. And what I talk to the students about is that as the unions declined, you know, from the 70s onward, unions declined, then middle class, there was like a death of the middle class, so to speak, right? Because the gap between wealth and poverty got larger and larger. So to me, the question becomes with this rise of the gig economy and the loss of unions, because even you see when workers tried to unionize at Amazon or they tried to unionize at Walmart or whatever, right? How these companies treated these workers. And everyone doesn't have these skill sets of writing or of technology, what about the people who still work with their hands? What does the future look like for them when you talk about the future of work?
You know, AI and automation first hit kind of manufacturing, and look at cars and how cars are built and how that's changed from an assembly line that's mostly people to an assembly line that's mostly machines. So this trend that all the knowledge workers are freaking out about now already hit the manufacturing world and hit people. And the other thing, I forget where I was, where someone was saying, like, it's great, we should support trade schools. You can make good livings doing all sorts of things, but there aren't enough jobs. There aren't enough of those jobs to like, if everybody stops going to college. There's a whole trend in this country where people don't think college is important anymore. Now, I will say it's partisan. Like there's a swath of maybe 30, 33, 40% of the country that has been taught to think academia is bad, college is bad, college is some liberal elite white tower stuff. They don't want their kids to go to college anymore. It's changed radically in the last 10 years. And the problem that this labor expert was talking about, I think it was on an episode of The Daily that I heard this, is that there aren't enough of those great paying labor oriented jobs, trade school oriented jobs to accommodate 20% more adults deciding they're not going to go to college and do these other things. When people look, this is something I say to, I'm on this private chat group with a bunch of people in media and tech, mostly New York. And when we talk about unemployment figures and all of that, our experience is really colored by the fact that tech and media has been hit very hard in these last few years. There are whole other industries that cannot get it. Healthcare cannot get enough workers. Certain industries are desperate for more workers, but you see where you live, right? So it's a rough space in tech and media right now. But I would say that some of that is just poor planning on the part of managers. Like I think there didn't need to be some of the layoffs that happened. And some of it, I honestly think, is just greed on the part of leaders.
Well, and shareholders. And I mean, so
yes.
I think you brought up a couple of interesting things, and I want to not necessarily push back, but I do want to, I know two people who are not in tech or media, and they've both been laid off for the better part of a year. They're both very senior people, probably making, upwards of two, and probably middle managers, right, within their organizations. One worked at Clorox, one worked at a makeup company, and so it's been really hard for them to find jobs. And it's funny because I had a conversation and I was like, oh, so it's not just tech and media. So that's the one piece. And then, but then the other thing I would sort of ask for your thoughts on is you talk about healthcare workers and the dearth of employment of talent in those fields. You also have a lot of people opting out. You have a bunch of nurses like, I'm not going to let you abuse me. You have a bunch of and so I think it's this bigger thing around kind of the concentration of wealth and healthy working conditions, right?
Yes.
And then the lack of money, the lack of interest. Then I also wonder, I think a lot of people are telling their children to not go to college because of the debt, right? And so you have all of these factors.
That's all tied into, the whole debt thing, that is all tied into suddenly it's only shooting for Ivies, like there's a whole kind of mentality about, I mean, I went to San Jose State University and I was not I wasn't super into traditional school, but I got in and out, got my degree, and it was $800 a semester when I went. And I know it doesn't cost that anymore, but I mean, there's this pressure of all the stuff we do now around college application and college selection. And it was not, I mean, you're not as old as I am probably, but it was, none of that was like that when I was going to college. So I just think we've gotten so hooked into like, there's only one way. The fact is that a college graduate will make more money lifetime than a non-college graduate. Yes. And I think we do our kids a disservice if we don't make it clear that it is a path to better monetization of your career. It's not the only path, but it is a path. But it doesn't have to be Harvard, and it doesn't have to be, I had a friend who was really upset his daughter didn't get into Cal or UCLA. And those are the two most applied for colleges in the UC system. She got into a UC. She's going to be totally fine. But he was convinced that this was just a tragedy. And I'm like, we need to dial it back for our kids. And I don't have kids, so it's easy for me to say, but so that's one thing I'd say, but I'd also say, yes, it's always the next generation asking to be treated humanely. Every older generation. I'm old enough to remember when millennials were the entitled ones. Now it's the Gen Zs, and we all have this tendency to create nostalgia around or valorize paying our dues when paying our dues was really being exploited.
Yes.
And we didn't like being exploited when we experienced it. But now we somehow blame and judge younger people who don't want to be exploited. And I'm like, we need to celebrate that. When we started Optionality, I thought it was going to be for people like me, senior in our careers. We don't want to give 110% to any one company anymore. We want to have many irons in the fire. We want more optionality because we also have responsibilities. I'm caregiving a parent. Jory has kids reaching their teens, one of whom has a health issue. Like, we have responsibilities. But what I'm realizing is that the newest generations coming into the workforce are going to be our partners in this because they have seen what their parents have gone through. And they're like, no, thank you. I want to be treated like a human from day one. Sorry. Sue me.
For sure. For sure. I mean, I have young people that work for me. One is a millennial, one's a Gen Z. And the stuff they say to me, like sometimes, and I see them as like, come on, guys, just let's get the job done. But then I have to second think what they're saying to me. They're like, just because you accepted this shit doesn't mean I have to accept it. You know what I mean? And we'll say, oh, you're Gen X, y'all were bad with the vacations. Like, I'm gonna take my vacations, right?
That
that's
whole
what they tell
unlimited
me.
PTO scam was based on people feeling too guilty to take the days and taking and keeping vacation pay off the balance sheet as a liability. Let's be real. That's what it was about. And now you've got people in the workplace who are saying unlimited PTO, awesome. Like, that's what you said. Like, what exactly am I doing wrong? And then managers are like, oh, fuck, no one's ever taken lots of PTO before. So yeah, it's a very different, they're learning from our mistakes. I went to an event over the 4th of July and there was a gal, Danielle Allen, who is in education and she's working on redesigning education. And she said something so poignant to me from her panel. She said, if we want to redesign education, we need to let go of what education was for us. We need to let go. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not going to succeed that way. And I thought it's so true about work too. And that means not just for many people, it's letting go of where you thrived. Like if it worked for you, why would you want to let go of it? But I do think there's this element of letting go where you struggled because we, in our looking back, valorize the struggle.
Oh, I don't. Let me tell you something. Like I will tell you that now. Like working at paid content, and that's like something. Oh my God, we were such miserable little reporters there because and the thought was not terrible, but it was just like we were expected to. I will never forget. Michael Jackson died. And I remember like he died and it was late in the day Pacific because it was and like I was actually at a bar at UCLA, near UCLA in Westwood, and I had to take out my laptop and file a story about Michael Jackson dying. And I just remember being like this, and I had like we had internet then. I had like this little thing I had to plug into my laptop.
Hotspot thingy.
Yeah. I had to plug into my laptop to upload this. And I just remember being like, and I just remember kind of being terrified that I didn't get this story up about Michael Jackson dying and the website traffic and because TMZ broke it at the time. And so again, this is not like I didn't work at a sweatshop, but
maybe valorize is the wrong word, but we want to believe our struggles meant something. That's what
I just think I am the cusp, right? So I'm part Gen X, part millennial. And so I'm like, fuck the struggle. Fuck that struggle. I'm not into it. I'm also like, there is something to being said for honing a craft. There is something to be said for learning, right? There is something to be said for getting better at what you do. And that does take some time and it does take some doing. So question for you, Elisa, how, with optionality, like what is optionality? Is it a community? How would you describe it? And what are you trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, so it's a community. And I will say that a lot of people know BlogHer as the company that like brought bloggers together and created a business model for them. Well, part of what was required for that was to broker a bridge between brands and bloggers because brands thought bloggers were the Wild West. Bloggers thought brands were going to ask them to sell their soul. And if you weren't a blogger that had millions of page views, you didn't have a business model. You didn't really have a model. So by aggregating bloggers together and selling them as cohorts and topic areas and like all of that, we created a business model that helped people make not millions of dollars, but $300 a month that helped them pay for their groceries, whatever it is. We helped create policies, frameworks that gave brands some brand safety trust, that they could trust that they were safe. We gave bloggers the option to opt out of certain kinds of advertising, the option to say you were like, I had on all my blogs, because I ate my dog food. I had blogs in the network. I said, I'm going to be profane. I'm not profane all the time, but I wanted to be profane when I wanted to be profane. So like I was a profanity blogger. That wasn't my topic area, but you know what I'm saying. And I was a vegan. I am a vegan, and I didn't want meat and dairy. Like I could like draw rules. And so we created this framework. So what we saw around the workforce and the workplace was that everyone we talked to who was sort of our contemporary within 20 years or so was saying the same thing about, I have a lot to give. I just don't want to give 100% in one place. But if I go to consulting, all of a sudden I have none of the benefits of being an employee, and I'm supposed to make it up in my rate. But there's this constant downward pressure, especially in times of layoffs. So like, why is it so binary? So that on the worker side, it's like, why is it so binary? There is actually no law against having part-time seasoned employees. People think of part-time as something that doesn't exist in knowledge work. There is no law against it, right? And for the companies, they're like, if you don't want to give me 110%, how do I know you're going to give me what I'm paying for? And there's like this lack of trust. And we could see communities being built for fractional workers, and we could see consultants trying to focus on companies and say, how can you work in this new hybrid workforce environment? And we were like, well, who's talking to each other? And maybe we could just kind of do the same thing where we bring people together. We start to build conversation and trust between management, which has management has objectives. Like I've been a manager. I have goals I need to meet, right? Like it's not a joke. Companies need revenue to stay in business, like, you know, and without the companies, you don't have the jobs. So like I had a friend who has an agency, and she was like, Elisa, just please, I love what you're doing, but please tell my story of like this thing that happened where my employee just didn't understand that I needed to do certain things to stay in business. And I'm like, yes, everybody's story matters. So the first thing is to bring people together in community to talk about these things, to help people figure out, okay, if I'm going to have an optionality driven life, what are the options I want? How do I pursue them? How do I balance them? So that's one side of it. But the other thing is to try to eventually come out with the kinds of proposals, research and proposals for how this could work. How could companies work with optionality driven workers in a way that was mutually beneficial, where they could trust each other and build a different model for independent workers? That's the big, like, we didn't get there in year one for BlogHer of building the new model for creators, right? That was a thing. We just wanted to help creators, well, bloggers, but now they would be called creators. We just wanted to help them come together, not feel alone, find each other, find their voice, find a place. And out of that grew a whole business model. And out of that grew an ecosystem that included the brands and the marketers who got to know all of those creators as people, right? So we kind of see the same. We see it as very similar, even if on the surface, it doesn't seem that similar. But like the ultimate goal is a new model for independent workers that's mutually beneficial. Today, we're just trying to help people find their place, find their voice, find what they want in their own set of options.
I think that's so interesting, because I also think while there are people who like to work for the government or the state or the city who retire early and that's what they do, right? There's a whole other set of people that they want to keep working, right? Beyond 60, whatever, because they like to work. They actually like what they do. But they don't have a framework for how to make this work beyond like, okay, I retired, but I want to continue working. How do I do that? How do I have benefits? How do I have all of these other things that I used to have when I had a job?
And what's the other thing that's interesting is that people of our contemporary and my contemporaries, we start to think a lot more about purpose, meaning, legacy, fulfillment. But you know what? The young generations coming into the workforce now, they're thinking about
With
that
that
today.
from the beginning.
And
Mhm.
and your only path shouldn't be to go find some nonprofit and be exploited making $25,000 a year at a nonprofit. Like that's not the only path to having fulfillment, purpose, and meaning in what you do.
So that brings me to another thing. You also wrote a book about revolutionaries, resistance, activism, advocacy. What took you down that path? And also, I see on your social media, you're doing a lot of advocacy work. So you want to talk about that aspect of your
Optionality
makeup of
of,
who
of,
you are? Yes,
of being a
of your
whole person.
optionality. Yes, yes.
So this goes way back for me when I first left high tech and I started blogging as a personal thing. And I kind of had my peanut butter chocolate moment where I realized it was also a good marketing tool that has now dated me for some portion of your audience, that reference. But the other thing I did was I went to volunteer before the 2004 election. And the way I ended up volunteering was being the blogger for the Santa Clara County Democratic Party for their website. It was a new thing, websites, blogs, like, and so I gave about half my time. I was like a daily hardcore political blogging person. And I was pretty like, I don't know if you remember the tenor of blogs in those days, but it was pretty like snarky, like pretty rabid, partisan hack. Like I was a partisan hack for sure. And I was also starting this consulting around helping brands and helping organizations blog. And I had everything I was doing on my website. And I had friends who would say, Lisa, don't you think you're going to lose half your audience when you reveal that you're blogging for the Democratic Party? And I said, listen, I should be so lucky as to have 100% of people want to work with me if only it weren't for my politics, you know? And I said, secondly, if they don't want to work with me on marketing because they don't like my politics, like, peace out. I'm better off. Like, it's fine. We wouldn't vibe in other ways. And that's okay. So I always had that perspective. Now, when we started BlogHer and we wanted to be omnipartisan and we wanted to hear from voices across the spectrum, and I was responsible for bringing speakers to the conferences, at certain points I was responsible for finding writers, I had to learn how to temper how I engage politically to not be quite so much of a hack, not so snarky, not so like, insulting. I was pretty insulting about George W. Bush. And I had to learn a different way to speak, but I couldn't hide who I was. The internet, I don't know if the internet's forever. I've lost plenty of work that I've published online when the sites take it down. So like the internet is not forever, but I always just felt like, you get me. I'm not going to try and have multiple personae. It's too complicated. I'm just one person online. You're going to see all of me. I have many interests and passions. That does not make it easy to become either a successful content creator or even a successful business voice, because people want you to be, niche. And I always used to say to people, there's two ways really to really monetize and get very big and popular in the blogging space. One is to be absolutely the niche person who is known as the expert on, let's say, hip hop feminism, like you can be the go-to person. The other is to have such a singular voice that you can talk about anything and people want to hear you say it. And the two examples I always use for that are Jenny Lawson, the blogess, and Lovey Ajayi Jones. Now, I don't know if she talks quite so wide-rangingly as she used to, but my God, she used to talk about like everything and anything, but it was her voice, right? And it was Jenny's voice. You wanted to hear what they thought about everything. And that is a much smaller number of people who can be successful that way. And it's much harder to do, to be that, it's a goal. It's like an aspiration, but it is extremely hard to achieve. And I think that's still pretty true today. People niche it down, or they have just a singular, singular topic or a singular voice. And I could never have a singular topic. I just am into too many things and I want to talk about them all. And it's an outlet of expression for me. And if that has lost me clients, okay. If that has lost me gigs, okay. Like I don't want to work on changing who I am to fit into some today's fashion of what is going to make me more able to succeed. So it's always been that way. And it's much simpler to stay that way. Like
that sounds very Gen Z, actually. Sounds very Gen Z.
I just like, but I have retained some of the ways I engage definitely were changed by BlogHer and by learning how to speak to people differently, and to have civil discourse and civil disagreement differently. And I have retained that a lot, not entirely. I've backtracked a little. I mean, P45 asterisk kind of made me backtrack a little on how I can keep my cool, like it's hard. But in general, I have changed the way I engage, and I'm much more about asking questions and really trying to get an answer. And I've always been like a data wonky person. So I just love to like dig in and say, this thing you said is so like actually inaccurate. And let me tell you why. Nobody likes that, but I'm just that pedantic nerd who wants to like tell you.
Elisa, I feel like we could talk to you for
Forever.
Forever. And so like, I love the fact that you aren't super niche and that you can talk about so many different things. I feel like our conversation has ranged from the future of work and optionality to the sort of the growth of the rise of Web 2.0 and online blogging and communities, to what it's like to be a woman in our industry, to even something that I've been thinking about, kind of the push to go back to work and sort of the connection to real estate. Something that you brought up that I want to dig into now is kind of the way that options and stock used to be granted and how that has shifted, because I'm like, oh my God, that's another piece of this.
Yeah.
We will have to have you back on. We will have to talk about the growth in optionality, among other things. We're also thinking of having an in-person experience. And so we're trying to figure out who the good speakers will be and why and how, and maybe this conversation on the evolution of creators as business people and work could be a good fit. Lynn, any final words from you?
No, I think you summed it all up well. I definitely hear a part 2 here, because I did have so many questions about the future of work and about optionality that we did not even get to, because we took a whole different turn. Even had more questions about content creation in general, and engagement as well. So I definitely feel like Tamika said, either you're going to come back in a month or two.
Happy to.
We'll definitely have you at our live event. Also, where can people find you?
Yes. So Optionality is at optionality.life. And our content is hosted on Substack. So we could talk a little bit about that. And then I'm at Elisa CP I'm on TikTok, Threads, and Instagram, mostly Threads, a little bit of TikTok and Instagram. And elisacp.com is my personal website.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all the good things, so that you can get more Tech and Soul in your inbox on a regular basis.